Well, recall for a moment from last week's lecture that I mentioned the ritual roots of society in Durkheim's vision. So he had this very kind of survivor, primitive tribe idea of kind of coming together, high collective social solidarity, moral order as dense as we're all a part of one social body. And Durkheim posited, now this might seem a little strange at first, but Durkheim looked around and thought, well, how is it that we categorize the world? How is it that we decide what's good and bad? How is it we decide where you can and cannot go, what you can and cannot do, who you can and cannot relate with? How are all these things decided? And Durkheim posited that the classification system we develop and in which we kind of forget that we're developing is actually born of social divisions that are occurring in these primal ritual moments when society is together. And the way Durkheim describes the classification process, or the classic classification process, is a sacred, profane, binary system. So you think of sacred, profane, you think of black, white, one or the other, this kind of distinction that's given by which you name some things as legitimate, sacred, and profane are those things that are not sacred, hence are illegitimate. Now keep in mind that last week we talked about collective representations, and those were kind of these trans-social ideals that carried a sense of society, projected ideals of society that was bigger than our individual persons. Sacred and profane is much more of a system that operates to kind of mark out and divide and to classify the world. So it's less about calling society to this conception of itself that it might aspire to and keep society glued together, and more about managing. The sacred and profane is more about managing the day-to-day activities of individuals as well as society itself. So Durkheim posited that during rituals, the markings of the sacred and the profane emerge. And so he would look at actual patterns of ritual and try and see how classification that was happening there ends up being the classification system that classifies all of social life. So for example, he might look at a ritual and say, I see women over there and men over there separated in this ritual. Or I see that this social group keeps coming back to the same exact spot in this field to do their ritual. Or he might note, why is it always that this group seems to come and do this ritual just as the sun drops below the horizon? So he was actually seeing these patterns in ritual life of a society that then got carried way beyond the ritual moment. In other words, got carried into the normal time of society. And what was interesting is he even saw the sacred and profane in terms of when society did rituals. So a ritual moment is a very sacred moment, but outside of that ritual moment is kind of profane time, profane space. We're no longer deeply connected socially. And he said to himself, well, how is it that society continues to manage itself, to manage its order outside of those moments? Well, it's with this sacred profane system. So you can see that Durkheim started to see the sacred profane binary system as kind of structuring everything, and it could structure within things. So we might see ritual moments as sacred and everything else is profane, but then as we look into the profane world, all those non-ritual moments, we see this sacred and profane system kind of happening again. So it's a system, the classification system Durkheim talks about is a nested system, a nested hierarchical system of sacred and profane binary distinctions. And the classic one, or the classic thing to look at as an example of sacred and profane marking, was a totem, a totemic object. We mentioned last week that tattoo that a member of a clan has is an example of a collective representation, a symbol, but it's also a totem in the sense of that it marks this person as sacred, this person as part of a group. But totems are even better, are even better understood as specific sacred objects, or a tree that a tribe says, wow, that's sacred, or a stream that a tribe says, whoa, that's sacred, stay out of that space. But then totemic objects would represent kind of certain spaces in the physical world, certain places that were that people either were or were not allowed to go into, or certain people were or were not allowed to go into. And then if an eagle, for example, was a totemic object of your clan, if it represented your clan, well then what the eagle did and who the eagle was sacred. So for example, Durkheim claimed that these groups would then divide up dietary laws based on the totemic object. In other words, you can't eat the eagle, you can't eat the eggs of the eagle, maybe you can't eat the things that an eagle eats because those are connected to that sacred eagle. And you can start to see in Durkheim's idea, even though a lot of his examples in the end didn't pan out, you start to see where he gets a sense that the whole social world is structured based on these relationships of sacred and profane that he says you can trace throughout all society. Now, what's important about thinking of the sacred and profane system is that we're not saying that society is naming relationships or determining relationships that naturally exist out there in the world. Instead, it's the opposite of that. Society, by naming relationships, is actually imposing order on the world. So by naming the system of sacred and profane into all parts of our life, we're actually controlling the world. And with sacred and profane distinctions, there are sets of rules that emerge. Now, a classic place for Durkheim to see these sets of rules are in religious rules, because sacred and profane, after all, sure sounds a lot like a religious system. And Durkheim says that these ideas of sacred and profane, many of which we've inherited in our own religious systems, for him are not primarily about keeping religion together or keeping control of the gods. He says, no, those are secondary. Instead, the system of sacred and profane, these beliefs are about keeping society together, keeping order together throughout all moments of society, whether we're together in a ritual or whether we're outside that ritual and hence on our own. So it's particularly in moments where we're less socially connected that the rules and the beliefs of sacred and profane keep us together, keep us on the right track, if you will. And so a classic place to find these beliefs, sacred and profane beliefs, are in something called taboos, and you've heard of taboos before. So taboos, for example, are rules about food, rules about time, rules about space, like which foods you do eat, which foods you don't eat, which time of the day you do something and which time of the day you don't do something, which spaces you do certain things in and which spaces you don't do certain things in. And these taboos were a way for a society to basically keep its members connected to itself, since we live most of our time outside of primitive survivor-like ritual moments. These taboos were ways to kind of continually order the world, order objects and times and spaces, so that actually we keep connected with each other. And Durkheim's absolutely incredible claim, if you read his whole book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he actually claimed that this simple system emerging from rituals, this simple sacred, profane, binary system of categorization was the basis for all further advanced social thought. And one example that we could see is in the reading from last week when Durkheim says, there's this belief that a lot of societies seem to have of a difference between a body and a soul. Well, for Durkheim, that in and of itself, of seeing a religious belief of body and soul, was a classic categorization belief that was based all the way down on society. Society, in this metaphor, this classification, being the body and the individual being the soul. So in Durkheim's view of the social world, you have these intense moments where society is together as body, connected, very densely connected, and then the rest of moments, maybe the majority of social life, where we're apart, where we are individuals. And for Durkheim, he looks at things from simple taboos, rules of classification, all the way to real complex thought ideas such as the body and the soul, and says all those things relate back to the basic structure of society, so that the belief in body and soul is nothing more for Durkheim than the projection the division between social time and individual time into thinking about the gods and thinking about lives, with soul being individual uniqueness and individuality, and body being something in the metaphor related to the actual social moment itself. So I'm going to insert a slide right here so you can see a couple of quotes from Durkheim and get a sense of actually how radical his thought is to claim that all systems of classification, including advanced thinking, can really be rooted back to this sacred and profane distinction. Now, the Zerubbabel reading we did was a great example of how you could expand way off of Durkheim and use classification processes to compare societies, to compare differences between societies, or to compare time periods within a society. And notice that we've talked early in the course about how do we do comparisons of societies in a way that is actually really legitimate. In other words, doesn't use kind of broad sweeping claims about values or different psychologies and that sorts of thing. And this is one way where you could do it, because Zerubbabel, in that wonderful little article with lots of examples, argued that each society has its own logic of classification. In other words, this sacred profane thing that Durkheim talked about, every society takes that and goes certain ways with it. So what you end up with is you can end up with very different classification systems. And the logic, the deep logic of sacred and profane is pretty much invisible to people living in these social systems. And because they've happened in different places, you can come up with very different results of classification, even though they're based on the same kind of deep logic of sacred and profane. And he gives some really intriguing examples, right? So, for example, classification of drugs. At one point, we all used to drink cocaine. So, Coke, literally, Coke in the early 1900s had at least some negligible amount of cocaine in it. At one point, marijuana was a drug and probably will be again. Heck, here in LA is again a basically legitimate substance for people to use. So the line of classifying substances that we might argue about the chemistry and biology of it all, if you trace back patterns of change in that line of classification over time, you see it's about cultural logics, cultural processes of making these distinctions between sacred and profane, drug, not drug. Another example is the idea of women's work, an idea that has fluctuated quite a bit throughout history and even our own society. In a farm era, there are certainly types of farm chores that women did that by the 1940s weren't considered women's work. Those were classified as men's work. Though lo and behold, again, we have a shift to the point now, especially as women enter combat in the military, another shifting again of what is quote-unquote women's work. Now, often there's been biological and scientific reasons given to justify that line at certain points in time, but what's important that we're seeing here is that culture, one of the main pieces of culture is this ongoing classification process where we draw lines to order the world around us. And then Zerubbabel notes that there are a classic place to see classification processes at work are what he calls border disputes, are those disputes that our society is engaged in to try and figure out where something belongs. So, example, currently, who should allow to be legally married? That gets to a deep question about what is marriage for. Clearly a big border dispute or debate in our society today. Who is an American? This is something I wrote about in my comments last week, when survey research often shows that certain groups of people who legally are Americans oftentimes aren't culturally classified, especially by white Americans, as quite seeming legitimately American, despite legal status. Or what is the line between church and state? A classic border dispute, a classic classification process between sacred and profane. And Zerubbabel's point is that every society is always ongoingly involved in trying to draw these lines, and in some ways forget about the reasons behind drawing these lines, but all of it as part of managing the order of society. So let me pause here and then I'll come back for one more section. I'll talk about Mary Douglas.